I loved my husband Chike with all my heart, and I knew he loved me too. We had been friends for years before we got married, and I believed that our bond was strong enough to withstand anything. Our wedding day was beautiful. I wore a white dress just like my sisters, and Chike looked so handsome in his suit. We exchanged vows in the same church where my sisters had been married, and I could see the worry in my parents' eyes as they watched us. But I was determined that my marriage would be different. For the first 2 weeks, everything was perfect. Chike and I were so happy together. We spent our days talking, laughing, and dreaming about our future. I couldn't imagine anything going wrong. Then one day, it happened, just like my sister's Adese. She was the first to get married, and everyone in the village came to celebrate with her and the husband. I still remember the day she was brought back home, tears streaming down her face. She wouldn't tell us what happened at first, but we could see the pain in her eyes. Eventually, she told us that Uche didn't want her anymore. He had started to become distant, cold, and then one day, he simply told her to pack her things and return to her father's house. We were all shocked. How could this happen? Adaeze was the perfect wife, kind, caring, and hardworking. But there was nothing we could do. She was back home and we had to accept it. Then it happened again with my second sister Ngozi, and again with my third sister Amaka, and even with my fourth sister Ifoma. Each time, the pattern was the same. They would get married, live happily for a while, and then suddenly they would be sent back home, rejected by their husbands, for reasons none of us could understand. Now my turn. Chike started to become distant. He would leave the house early in the morning and come back late at night, barely speaking to me. I could feel him slipping away, but I didn't know how to stop it. After 2 weeks, he sent me back to my father's house also. Just like that, my marriage was over. I was devastated. I loved Chike so much, and I couldn't understand why this was happening to me. When I got home, my grandmother was there. She was a wise old woman, respected by everyone in the village. When she saw me crying, she told me not to worry. She said that another man, even better than Chike, would come to marry me. But I couldn't believe it. I didn't want another man. Chike was my husband, and I wasn't going to give up on him. Unlike my sisters, I was a strong Christian. I had always believed in the power of prayer, and I knew that God had the power to change things. I said to myself, they may have succeeded in bringing me back to my father's house, but they can't keep me here. I decided to do something different, something powerful. I began to pray. Every night from midnight until 4 a.m., I prayed. I prayed like never before. I asked God to break whatever curse was hanging on my family, to restore my marriage, and to bring peace back into our lives. I knew that only God could help us. Each night, as the clock struck midnight, I would quietly rise from my bed. The house was silent, with only the sounds of the night to keep me company. But I wasn't alone. I felt a presence with me, a sense of peace and strength that I knew could only come from God. I would kneel by my bedside and begin to pray, pouring out my heart and soul with every word. At first, the prayers were simple. I prayed for my marriage, for Chike to come back to me, for whatever that had caused this curse on my family to be broken. But as the days went on, my prayers became more intense. I changed my prayer points to my father, my father. Every power assigned to bring me back to my father's house expire. I began to feel a fire burning within me, a determination that nothing and no one could stand in the way of what God had planned for me. I didn't care that I was tired. I didn't care that I was losing sleep. All that mattered was breaking this cycle, this evil that had taken hold of my family. I knew that something dark was at work, and I was ready to fight it with everything I had. My grandmother, who usually woke up before anyone else to begin her morning worship of nature, noticed my nightly prayers. One morning, she pulled me aside, her voice gentle but firm. Ebere, she said, you are not sleeping at night. You pray too much. You should rest. But I knew better than to be swayed. Grandma, I need to pray, I replied. This is something I must do. At first, she didn't press me further. But as the days passed and my prayers continued, and I changed my prayer points to every evil hand holding me back in this house, break by fire, her demeanor began to change. One day, her gentle concern turned into something darker, something that sent a chill down my spine. Why do you keep praying like this? She asked, her voice low and sharp. Do you want to kill someone? I said, do you want someone to die? Stop these prayers, Ebere, before it's too late. Her words shocked me, but they also confirmed what I had begun to suspect. There was something more to my grandmother than met the eye. Why would she be so concerned about my prayers? Unless, of course, my prayers were having an effect on something she didn't want me to know about. I looked her in the eyes and saw something that made me even more determined. There was fear in her gaze, a fear that she couldn't hide. It was then that I realized the truth. My grandmother was somehow connected to the curse on my family. Instead of heeding her warning, I intensified my prayers. I didn't care about the danger. I knew that God was with me, and I wasn't going to stop until I had broken whatever power was holding my family captive. As I continued my nightly vigils, the tension between my grandmother and me grew. She stopped speaking to me during the day, but I could feel her watching me. The rest of the family noticed the change too, though they didn't understand what was happening. I started to feel uneasy in her presence, but I didn't let that stop me. If anything, it fueled my resolve. I knew that whatever darkness was lurking in her home, it was being weakened by my prayers, and I wasn't going to stop. One night, as I was deep in prayer, I heard footsteps approaching my room. The door creaked open, and I saw my grandmother standing in the doorway. Her face was twisted with anger, her eyes wild. Ebere, you must stop this, she hissed. You don't know what you're doing. If you continue, you will bring disaster upon this family. But I wasn't afraid. I stood up and faced her, my voice steady and strong. No, Grandma, it's you who doesn't understand. There is no power greater than God's, and I will not stop praying until this evil is gone. Her face contorted with rage, and for a moment I thought she might lash out at me. But instead, she turned and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. That night, as I knelt back down to pray, I knew that something was about to change. I could feel it in the air, a tension that was building to a breaking point. I prayed harder than ever before, asking God to reveal the truth and to arise in anger at the wicked. The next morning, something happened that no one could have expected. It was still dark when I awoke, the early morning light just beginning to creep through the cracks in the windows. The house was eerily silent, more so than usual. Normally, by this time, my grandmother would be up, moving about the house and preparing for her morning prayers. But today, there was nothing. I went to her room and knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I called out to her, but still there was only silence. A sense of dread filled me as I slowly pushed the door open. There she was, lying still on her bed. I knew instantly that she was gone. Her face was peaceful, as if she had simply fallen asleep and never woken up. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to her death, something connected to the prayers I had been saying. The family was in shock. My mother cried out in sorrow. My sisters gathered around, confused and afraid. But as we began to prepare for the burial, something even more shocking was discovered. When my sisters and I were tasked with cleaning out her room, we found something hidden under her bed that sent chills down our spines. It was a box, old and worn, and inside were dolls, small, handmade figures, each one with a name written on it. Our names, our husbands' names. The dolls were bound with black and red threads, twisted tight around their limbs, and their backs were turned back to back, as if they were being forced to look in the opposite direction. Beneath them were padlocks, each one with a slip of paper tied to it. When we unwrapped the paper, we saw our names and the names of our husbands written in a language we didn't understand. I felt sick to my stomach. My grandmother, the woman who had raised us, who had been a part of our lives for so long, was the one who had cursed us. She had used these dolls and padlocks to bind us to keep us from happiness, to break our marriages and send us back home. With tears in our eyes, we gathered everything we found and took it outside. We broke the padlocks, tearing away the threads, and threw everything into a fire. As the flames consumed the dolls and the locks, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, as if a dark cloud had been hanging over us for years and was finally dissipating. That night, as the fire burned, I prayed once more, thanking God for revealing the truth and for breaking the curse that had plagued our family for so long. The next morning, something even more miraculous happened. As the sun rose, casting a warm glow over the village, we heard a knock at the door. When we opened it, there stood Chike, my husband. His face was filled with confusion, as if he had been in a daze and was just waking up. Ebere, he said softly, I don't know what happened, but I felt like I had to come back. I can't explain it, but I need you. I need us to be together. I was overwhelmed with emotion as I reached out to him, pulling him into an embrace. I knew that this was the result of the prayers, the breaking of the curse. But it wasn't just Chike who came back. One by one, my sister's husbands returned as well, each of them with the same look of bewilderment on their faces. It was as if a veil had been lifted, and they could finally see clearly again. They apologized. not fully understanding what had happened, but knowing that they had wronged their wives. They begged for forgiveness, and my sister, still in shock, embraced them as I had embraced Chike. But that wasn't the only miracle. My mother, who had been blind for years, suddenly regained her sight. She cried out in amazement as she looked around the room, seeing her daughters and sons in law standing together, whole once more. My father, who had been struggling with his business, received a call that very week. The goods that had been seized at the port were released, and his business began to flourish again. Peace returned to our home, and with it, prosperity and happiness. The darkness that had hung over our family was gone, and in its place was a light so bright it filled every corner of our lives. We knew that witchcraft was real, but we also knew that the power of God was more real. The curse that had haunted us for so long was broken, and we were free. As I stood in the midst of my family, my heart full of gratitude, I knew that the battle had been won, not by us, but by the power of prayer and by the grace of God. And so, if there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that if there is a man to pray, there is a God to answer. We may face trials, we may encounter darkness, but with faith and determination, no curse can stand in the way of God's plan for our lives.
Thanks for watching. Support my channel by subscribing, liking, sharing, and turning on notifications to stay updated on new stories.